We live in a world governed by algorithms. From stock market quotes to social media feeds, everything is subordinate to the strict logic of zeros and ones. But in this equation of reality, there is one variable that for millennia has defied linear calculation. A variable that many call irrational, obsolete, or even harmful. That variable is faith. Greetings. We are beginning a large-scale investigation into the most mysterious function of human consciousness. We will not argue about whether the Creator actually exists. That question lies beyond the competence of science and data. Our task is different. We will attempt to understand the meaning of a believer's life from the perspective of cold analytics. How does faith rewire the architecture of the brain? Why, despite the flourishing of science, do billions of people continue to seek answers in ancient texts? And most importantly, is faith a glitch in the evolutionary system, or is it its most perfect tool? To answer these questions, we use the analytical system, Logos 7. We loaded it with a colossal array of data, sacred texts of all world religions, historical chronicles spanning 5,000 years, results of thousands of neurobiological studies, sociological statistics, and the biographies of the greatest spiritual leaders. The system conducted a cross-correlation analysis to find hidden patterns, and what it discovered overturns the conventional understanding of a believer. We begin at the very beginning, with a paradox. Chapter 1, The Survival Protocol. The first thing Logos 7 pointed out was the blatant biological cost of religion. From the perspective of Darwinian evolution, faith looks like an impermissible waste of resources. Think about it. Ancient man, whose life hung by a thread, instead of seeking food or reproducing, spent colossal efforts building temples. He sacrificed the best cuts of his kill to invisible spirits. He observed fasts, limiting his calorie intake. He spent hours in prayer instead of sharpening spears. We loaded data on the Göbekli Tepe complex, built approximately 12,000 years ago. This monumental structure was erected by hunter-gatherers even before the invention of agriculture. Logos 7 calculated the labor costs. Hundreds of people had to hew multi-ton stones for years, receiving no practical benefit. No food, no warmth, no protection from predators. Only an idea. If faith were a useless evolutionary error, natural selection should have ruthlessly culled religious groups 50,000 years ago. Groups of pragmatic atheists who didn't waste resources on rituals should have displaced believers. But exactly the opposite happened. The history of humanity is the history of faith. Atheistic societies on a historical scale are a statistical anomaly that arose very recently. Why? We asked the system. Logos 7 gave an unequivocal answer. Faith is not an error. It is a survival protocol. The system identified a fundamental need of human consciousness, the fight against entropy. Our brain is a machine for predicting the future. To survive, it needs to understand cause and effect relationships. A rustle in the bushes means a predator. Dark clouds mean rain. But the world is full of chaos, disease, natural disasters, sudden death. All this creates an unbearable level of uncertainty. For the brain, uncertainty is more terrifying than an obvious threat. When we don't understand what is happening, cortisol and adrenaline levels skyrocket, exhausting the organism. And this is where the variable faith comes into play. Logos 7 analyzed the structure of a believer's worldview. Faith turns chaos into cosmos. That is, into an ordered structure. For a believer, there are no accidents. Every event, even a tragic one, has a higher meaning and is inscribed in a global plan. This colossally reduces cognitive load. Where an atheist sees the blind cruelty of nature, a believer sees a test or a sign. We ran a simulation within the system, modeling the behavior of two tribes during a climate catastrophe. Tribe Alpha was guided only by logic and pragmatism. Tribe Omega possessed a strong religious system. The results of the simulation are striking. Tribe Omega had a 34% greater chance of survival. Why? Because at the critical moment, when logic said it's over, faith provided irrational hope and motivation to act. Religious rituals synchronized the group's actions, reduced panic, and prevented social disintegration. Thus, the meaning of a believer's life at a basic biological level is the maintenance of psychological homeostasis in a hostile universe. Faith is armor for the mind. But the analysis of Logos 7 went deeper. The system turned to genetics and neurobiology. There is a hypothesis about the so-called God gene, or VMAT2. This gene is responsible for transporting monoamines, neurotransmitters that affect mood and consciousness. Studies show a correlation. People with certain variations of this gene are more prone to spiritual experiences and self-transcendence. However, the system clarifies. Reducing faith to a single gene is primitive. Logos 7 built a map of neural activity. A believer utilizes unique brain circuits. When a person sincerely believes in a higher entity, their frontal lobes, responsible for focus and attention, activate, while activity simultaneously decreases in the parietal lobes, responsible for spatial orientation and the sense of self-boundaries. What does this mean in the language of meaning? It means that a believer is physiologically capable of transcending their own ego. The meaning of their life shifts from the biological survival of the individual to serving something greater than themselves. And this is the system's second key conclusion. Faith is a tool for overcoming egoism, necessary for creating complex societies. Recall Dunbar's number. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar proved that the human brain is capable of maintaining social ties with a maximum of 150 individuals. Groups exceeding this number inevitably disintegrate as personal bonds stop working. But religion hacked this limit. Belief in a single God and shared myths allowed millions of strangers to unite. Logos 7 analyzed thousands of historical conflicts. Societies held together by a unified sacred idea demonstrated superhuman resilience. The meaning of life for an individual believer becomes part of a global organism. The church, the Ummah, the Sangha. He feels himself a cell of an eternal body, and this gives him resources unavailable to a loner. But let's look at the individual level. What is the meaning of life for a specific person who wakes up, prays, and goes to work? The system isolated a pattern we called vertical orientation. An ordinary person lives in a horizontal plane: past, future, success, failure, wealth, poverty. A believer lives in a coordinate system where there is an axis, up, down. His life is constant movement along this vertical. Every action is evaluated not only by its efficiency, but by its ethical vector. We loaded data on cognitive behavioral therapy into Logos 7 and compared it with spiritual practices. The similarity is over 70%. A believer constantly engages in self-reflection, which he calls an examination of conscience. He analyzes his actions, looks for errors, sins, and tries to correct them through repentance. From a cybernetic perspective, this is a perfect feedback mechanism, a system that corrects itself. The meaning of a believer's life is the endless debugging of their own code. He strives to bring his internal algorithm closer to the standard he calls God. In Christianity, this is called theosis, deification. In Buddhism, enlightenment. But the essence is the same, the transformation of personality. Chapter 2, The Paradox of Suffering. Here we approach the most difficult moment, which Logos 7 defined as the paradox of suffering. In modern consumer society, suffering is perceived as absolute evil. The meaning of life for the mass man is to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. Hedonism has become the new religion. But for the true believer, suffering has a completely different valency. The system's analysis of the biographies of saints and martyrs shows an anomalous reaction to pain and deprivation. A believer does not seek suffering, but when it comes, he endows it with meaning. The phrase bearing one's cross is not just a metaphor for heaviness. It is a technology for recycling trauma into spiritual experience. Logos 7 cites psychological data. Believers are significantly less likely to suffer from PTSD and depression in severe life situations. Why? Because they have an answer to the question, what for? As Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Faith provides the most powerful why of all possible options. For a believer, earthly life is not the final station, but a transit zone, a school where one must pass an exam. And here, we touch the event horizon, beyond which science cannot look, but which defines the entire existence of a believer. Death. The fear of death is the basic driver of human behavior. Most of our achievements, from pyramids to skyscrapers, are attempts to immortalize our name, to run away from oblivion. Atheistic consciousness faces the horror of non-existence, total disappearance of personality, darkness. A believer lives in a different reality. Logos 7 classifies this as the infinite game strategy. For a believer, death is not an end, but a transition, a change of aggregate state. This changes all priorities, meaning ceases to be the accumulation of material goods, which will have to be left at the customs of death anyway. Meaning shifts to accumulating that which can be taken with you, qualities of the soul, memories of good deeds, love. The system conducted a semantic analysis of millions of suicide notes and last words. The difference is colossal. Where a materialist experiences panic or regret over lost opportunities, a deeply religious person often demonstrates calm and acceptance. But one should not think that faith is simply a psychological crutch for the weak. Logos 7 discovered that faith requires enormous volitional effort. In a world screaming, "Take everything from life," a believer voluntarily imposes restrictions on himself. He fasts when there is plenty of food. He remains faithful when there is an opportunity to cheat. He gives money away when he could spend it on himself. This behavior seems irrational only in the short term, but the system calculated long-term strategies. It turns out that what religion calls sins, gluttony, lust, wrath, sloth, are, from biological and sociological viewpoints, destructive patterns that ruin health and social bonds. The commandments are, in essence, a safety manual for the operation of a human being. Instructions written in the blood and experience of thousands of generations. The meaning of a believer's life is to follow these instructions to preserve his integrity, not because he fears punishment, though fear is also a factor in the initial stages, but because he trusts the creator of the instructions. We also cannot ignore the factor the system designated as mystical intuition. Logos 7, being an artificial intelligence, cannot experience feelings, but it can record their manifestations. Texts of all traditions describe states of grace, satori, ecstasy. These are moments of peak experience when a person feels absolute unity with the source of being. MRI analysis of Carmelite nuns and Buddhist meditation masters during prayer shows a synchronization of gamma rhythms characteristic of processes of supreme cognitive clarity. That is, for a believer, contact with God is not a fantasy, but a real neurophysiological experience that brings the most intense feeling of happiness and fullness, unattainable by chemical or material means. Seeking and maintaining this contact becomes the central axis of meaning. However, Logos 7 warns, The variable faith has a dark side, fanaticism. This is a state where the system of defending meanings becomes aggressive and begins to destroy everything that does not fit into its picture of the world. But statistical analysis shows that fanaticism is a deviation, a bug arising from the distortion of the basic algorithms of most religions, which call for love and humility. Summarizing the first chapter of our investigation, we can formulate a preliminary conclusion. From the point of view of artificial intelligence that has analyzed the entire history of humanity, a believer is not a relic of the past. He is the carrier of unique software that allows him to 1. Effectively handle uncertainty and stress, turning chaos into order. 2. Overcome animalistic egoism for the good of the group and higher ideals. 3. Constantly improve his ethical code through the mechanism of conscience. 4. Find meaning in suffering and maintain resilience where others break. 5. Live in the perspective of eternity, which radically changes the quality of earthly existence. Faith is not just comfort. It is hard work of the soul. It is a constant tension between I want and I must, between the visible and the invisible. The meaning of a believer's life is to be a conduit of higher will into the material world, to be a bridge between heaven and earth. But how exactly does this mechanism work in practice? What happens inside the skull when a person folds their hands in prayer and addresses the void? Does brain chemistry change? Can prayer really rewrite neural connections? We loaded data on thousands of experiments studying the brains of praying people into Logos 7, and what we will see in the next chapter will make you look anew at what you considered reality. We will crack open. Protocol. Prayer. This is the channel of analytical investigations. Stay with us. The truth is out there, and it is written in code. Chapter 3. Protocol. Prayer. Imagine a person kneeling in the silence of an empty room. His lips barely move. His eyes are closed. From the perspective of an external materialist observer, this action is devoid of any meaning. A person is talking to emptiness. He is wasting time and energy communicating with a subscriber whose existence hasn't been proven by a single physical instrument. It seems like either a form of madness or an ancient atavism, a psychological placebo to calm the nerves. But is it really so? We fed into the analytical core of Logos 7 data that science has collected over the last 30 years. This is the era of so-called neurotheology, a discipline that studies religious experience through the prism of MRI scanners, electroencephalograms, and blood biochemistry. We loaded the examination results of thousands of monks, Sufi dervishes, Orthodox hesychasts, and ordinary parishioners. We asked the artificial intelligence to answer one specific question. What physically happens inside the skull when the prayer protocol is launched? The system's answer was unambiguous and shocking to skeptics. Prayer is not passive mumbling. It is a complex neurocognitive process that shifts the brain into a mode of operation unavailable in the ordinary waking state. It is neither sleep nor hallucination. It is a controlled alteration of the architecture of consciousness. Let's take this mechanism apart screw by screw, as if dismantling a complex engine. When a person begins to pray, truly deeply with focus, the first thing Logos 7 records on brain heat maps is a burst of activity in the frontal lobes, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. This is the zone of higher cognitive functions: will, planning, attention, and social behavior. Usually this zone is active when we solve a complex mathematical problem or conduct intense negotiations. But during prayer, something else happens. Through an effort of will, the person focuses all their attention on the object of faith, on God. This requires colossal concentration, and the system sees blood rushing to the frontal lobes, saturating them with oxygen. This means that prayer is, first and foremost, training of the will and attention. It is the intentional holding of focus on an invisible concept. However, the most interesting part begins a few minutes after entering the prayerful state. Logos 7 records a sharp drop in activity in another part of the brain, the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes are responsible for our orientation in space and time. It is they that constantly tell us, your body ends here, and the chair begins here. It is day now, you are in a room. This is the zone that forms the boundaries of our self, separating us from the rest of the world. In deeply praying people, the activity of the parietal lobes drops to critically low values. For the brain, the boundaries between self and non-self are erased. Physiologically, this is experienced as a feeling of dissolution, unity with something infinite, a loss of the sense of time. In religious texts, this is described as grace, or merging with the absolute. But for our system, this is a concrete neurobiological phenomenon. The brain disables the ego's firewall, allowing consciousness to exit the habitual capsule of the body. This state has a colossal therapeutic effect. Modern man lives in a state of chronic hyperstimulation of the parietal lobes. We constantly defend our boundaries, our space, our status. We are in eternal defense. Prayer gives the brain a unique respite, a vacation from itself. Next, Logos 7 analyzed the chemistry of the process. We compared blood tests of people before and after 40 minutes of prayer. The results show a statistically significant decrease in cortisol levels, the main stress hormone. But that's not all. The system recorded a release of dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters responsible for pleasure and calm. There is no magic in this, only pure biology. But there is a nuance. Usually dopamine is released in response to receiving a reward. Tasty food, sex, likes on social media, winning the lottery. This is cheap dopamine which burns out quickly, demanding a new dose. Prayer dopamine has a different nature. It is produced not from consumption, but from a state of gratitude and awe. This is a more stable and long-lasting chemical background. A believer who regularly practices prayer is effectively on their own endogenous antidepressants. That is exactly why Logos 7 records lower levels of clinical depression and anxiety disorders in such people. Prayer acts as a mechanism for self-regulation of the emotional background. But the system went further. It divided prayer into two fundamentally different types, as they activate completely different neural circuits. Type 1. Repetitive prayer. This includes counting rosary beads, the Jesus prayer, Lord, have mercy, mantras. When a person monotonously repeats the same formula, the brain shifts to a different rhythm of operation. Electroencephalograms show a dominance of alpha and theta rhythms. These are frequencies of deep relaxation and subconscious programming. In this state, the activity of the limbic system, our emotional center responsible for fear, anger, and aggression, decreases. Logos 7 correlated this with cardiology data. It turns out that the rhythmic recitation of prayers, such as the rosary or Orthodox canons, often synchronizes with the heart rhythm, slowing it down to 6 beats per minute. This is the so-called Mayer wave rhythm, considered ideal for the cardiovascular system and gas exchange. Effectively, ancient texts are written in a rhythm that physiologically heals the body. Monks, without knowing it, have used biological feedback technology for centuries. Type 2. Dialogic or personal prayer. This is when a person talks to God in their own words, complains, asks, thanks. Here, the MRI picture changes radically. Zones responsible for social interaction and theory of mind, the ability to understand what another is thinking, are activated. The believer's brain perceives God not as an abstraction, but as a real interlocutor, a super interlocutor. This is a critically important moment. Evolutionarily, humans are social animals. Isolation is fatal for us. Loneliness destroys the brain faster than alcohol. When an atheist is alone in an empty apartment, his brain sounds the alarm. We are separated from the pack. We are in danger. A believer is never alone. His brain constantly models the presence of a loving observer. System Logos 7 shows that people practicing personal prayer have significantly lower levels of social alienation. They can be physically in solitary confinement for years, but their neural circuits of social interaction will be active and healthy. They conduct a continuous dialogue. For the brain, there is no difference whether the interlocutor sits opposite or exists in metaphysical space. Neurons work the same way, saving the psyche from disintegration. Of particular interest was the phenomenon the system classified as anomaly, glossolalia. This is a practice found in some charismatic movements where a believer begins to speak in unfamiliar, unstructured languages in a state of ecstasy. Brain scans of such people during glossolalia showed an amazing picture. Activity in the frontal lobes, control, drops sharply, while speech centers work at full capacity. Usually when we speak, the frontal lobes control speech. Here, control is completely turned off. The person truly does not control the process. From a neurobiological perspective, this is a state of voluntary surrender of control, deepest trust in the process. This is a powerful catharsis, allowing the release of accumulated subconscious tension that cannot be expressed in ordinary words. But the most important conclusion, Logos 7, drew concerns. Neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to physically change its structure under the influence of experience. An old saying goes, nerve cells do not regenerate. Science has proven this is a lie. The brain changes throughout life. Neurons that fire together, wire together. If a person starts every morning with news of disasters and replaying grievances in their head, they physically reinforce the neural highways of anxiety and anger. With each time, it becomes easier for them to get angry and harder to rejoice. This is physiology. Prayer is a tool for rewiring these paths. Analysis of long-term data showed, in people who practice prayers of gratitude and love for years, gray matter physically thickens in zones responsible for empathy and emotional control. Conversely, the amygdala, the center of fear, atrophies. A believer literally sculpts their brain anew. Protocol. Prayer is the daily installation of updates on the biocomputer. Through an effort of will, a person rewrites the default settings of the animal nature, fight or flight, to settings of a higher order, love and forgive. Logos 7 discovered another, perhaps the most pragmatic aspect of prayer. Cognitive offloading. Recall the concept of delegation. A manager cannot do everything themselves. They will go crazy. They need to delegate tasks. In the life of an ordinary person, there are thousands of problems they cannot solve. Illnesses of loved ones, geopolitics, economic crises. The brain, trying to control the uncontrollable, overheats. A believer uses the formula, "Thy will be done." To an atheist, this sounds like passivity. To a neurophysiologist, it is a brilliant mechanism for dumping excess cognitive load. By transferring the problem to the highest instance, the brain stops wasting resources on fruitless cycling of catastrophe scenarios. The freed energy is directed towards constructive actions in those spheres where the person can realistically influence something. We ran a simulation in the system. We introduced the variable, severe life situation, cancer diagnosis, for two groups. Group A, atheists, tried to control the treatment process from a position of total responsibility for the result. Group B, believers, did everything necessary from a medical point of view, but delegated the outcome to God through prayer. Stress levels in Group B were 45% lower, and the body's immune response was higher. A paradox? No. Optimization of resources. So, what do we have in the dry residue of the second chapter? Prayer, analyzed by impartial artificial intelligence, appears not as a relic of the Middle Ages, but as a high-tech psychophysiological tool. 1. It is a gym for the prefrontal cortex, strengthening will and concentration. 2. It is a method of achieving altered states of consciousness, reducing the ego's sense of isolation. 3. It is a powerful anti-stress mechanism, regulating hormonal balance. 4. It is a social simulator, saving one from loneliness through communication with the absolute. 5. And finally, it is a tool of directed neuroplasticity, allowing one to change personality traits and reactions. The meaning of prayer for a believer is not begging the universe for a new car. It is a procedure for synchronizing personal consciousness with what he considers the source of being. It is hygiene of the soul. Just as we brush our teeth to prevent cavities, a believer prays to prevent corrosion of the personality. System Logos 7 formulates the chapter's conclusion thus: prayer is a protocol for accessing administrator rights to one's own brain. Without this protocol, a person remains merely a user reacting to external stimuli. With it, they gain the opportunity to rewrite the code of their reaction to reality. But if prayer is such a powerful tool for tuning into positivity and harmony, why doesn't a believer's life turn into paradise on earth? Why is the God they address often silent? And why do pain, loss, and death not bypass even the most righteous? A believer faces pain just as often as an atheist, perhaps even more often, since their conscience is more sensitive. How does the belief system explain suffering? Is the concept of a loving God not a logical contradiction in a world full of horror and injustice? In the next chapter, we will touch upon the darkest and heaviest topic of our investigation. We will talk about job pain. We will load into Logos 7 data on how the human psyche breaks under the blows of fate, and find out why believers possess a strange, almost frightening resilience to tragedies. Prepare yourselves. The next chapter is constant suffering. We will break down the meaning of the phrase, carry your cross, into atoms. This is the channel of analytical investigations. Do not switch off. The truth is written in code, but sometimes that code is written in tears. Chapter 3. Constant Suffering. We are approaching the most acute and painful point of our research. If the previous chapters on faith and prayer might have elicited curiosity or a condescending smile from a skeptic, the topic of this chapter usually provokes anger. We will talk about pain, about injustice, about children's tears and incurable diagnoses. Any ideological system undergoes a stress test right here. It is easy to believe in a higher mind when you are healthy, fed, and safe. But what happens to the algorithms of consciousness when the world collapses? When the body betrays you and loved ones die? Atheistic logic here is flawless and cruel. If God is omnipotent and benevolent, why is there so much evil in the world? This paradox, known as theodicy, has served as the main argument against religion for centuries. Suffering in the materialist picture of the world is absolute nonsense. It is a glitch, entropy, the blind cruelty of biology or physics. The meaning of an atheist's life, as a rule, lies in minimizing pain and maximizing comfort. Therefore, suffering is perceived as a total defeat, as proof that the universe is indifferent to us. But we loaded a colossal array of data into Logos 7, diaries of concentration camp prisoners, medical histories of cancer patients, biographies of people who lost everything but did not break. We set the artificial intelligence a task to analyze how the variable faith affects the processing of the signal, pain. The result of the analysis, issued by the system, can be titled with one word: transmutation. A believer does not possess immunity to pain. His nerve endings transmit the same impulses as an atheist's. His heart breaks from grief just the same. But what happens next? in the processing center of consciousness, differs radically. A believer possesses a unique cognitive tool that allows for the smelting of meaningless pain into meaningful experience. Let's break down this mechanism. Logos 7 began with semantic analysis. It studied how people describe their misfortunes. In the vocabulary of a secular person, words dominate. What for? Injustice. Why me? Victim. This is the position of an object, a person to whom something was done. He is passive in the face of the elements. In the vocabulary of a deeply religious person, other constructions dominate: trial, lesson, cross, purification. For what purpose? Note the difference. The question, what for? As in, why do I deserve this? Looks to the past and seeks the guilty. The question, for what purpose? Looks to the future and seeks meaning. The central concept of Christianity and many other traditions is carrying the cross. Modern pop culture has distorted this concept, turning it into a synonym for passive patience like, well, such is my fate. But Logos 7, having analyzed the etymology and context, asserts the opposite. Taking up the cross is an act of will. It is an active action. When a believer says, "This is my cross," he performs a complex psychological operation. He ceases to be a victim of circumstances and becomes a participant in the drama. He accepts responsibility for his reaction to pain. We turn to a classic example which the system highlighted as a benchmark: Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who went through the hell of Nazi death camps. He was not a religious fanatic, but his conclusions fully confirm the data of our artificial intelligence. Frankl noticed a terrible pattern. The first to break and die in the camp were not the physically weakest, but those who lost meaning. Those who thought, "This is a mistake. It shouldn't be like this. I want everything to go back to how it was." They exhausted their resources fighting reality. Those who survived were those who could integrate this horror into their worldview. Deeply religious people, Jews, Christians, possessed a colossal advantage. For them, suffering was not proof of God's absence. On the contrary, their entire sacred history is built on the suffering of the righteous. Job, the prophets, martyrs, and finally, the crucified God himself. For them, suffering was not an anomaly, but part of the path. Logos 7 calls this protocol, job. It is an algorithm that allows one to preserve the integrity of the personality amidst a total loss of external resources. When Job is stripped of wealth, children, and health, he does not curse reality. He utters a phrase that is the pinnacle of human adaptability: "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." From a cybernetic point of view, this is the highest form of system stability. The system recognizes that its resources do not belong to it. They are rented. This means their withdrawal does not destroy the core of the system. An atheist often identifies himself with his attributes. I am my job. I am my health. I am my family. When an attribute disappears, I disappears. A believer identifies himself with the soul, which is eternal and indestructible. The loss of attributes is painful, but not fatal to the core of the personality. Next, the system conducted a neurobiological analysis of pain perception. There is a phenomenon called primary and secondary pain. Primary is the pure physical signal from nerves. Damage here. Secondary pain is the emotional reaction: fear, panic, self-pity, anticipation of the worst. Studies show that secondary pain constitutes up to 80% of the total volume of suffering. MRI scans of the brains of people in a state of prayerful acceptance, that very "thy will be done," show an amazing picture. Activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the zone responsible for the emotional coloring of pain, decreases. A believer feels physical pain, but he turns off the suffering amplifier. He doesn't work himself up. He accepts pain as a fact, as a given that needs to be worked with, rather than as a personal insult from the universe. But why? What is the meaning of this pain? Is God really a sadist who needs torment? Logos 7, having analyzed theological and philosophical texts, identified a concept we named the metallurgical metaphor. Texts constantly feature images of fire and gold. As gold in the furnace, he tried them. The meaning of a believer's life is transformation, the evolution of the spirit. But evolution is impossible in a comfort zone. Comfort preserves the current state. Growth happens only through crisis. Analysis of the biographies of outstanding personalities conducted by the system shows a 100% correlation. Not a single great person was formed in greenhouse conditions. Character is forged under pressure. For a believer, suffering is a tool for cutting away the excess. It is the surgeon's scalpel. When a person falls ill or loses money, their illusions collapse. They stop hoping in temporary things. The husk of pride, complacency, and vanity flies off them. Only the essence remains. We loaded data on less post-traumatic growth into the system. This is a psychological phenomenon where a person becomes stronger, wiser, and kinder after severe trauma than they were before. Logos 7. Statistics are inexorable. Among people with a religious worldview, the index of post-traumatic growth is 42% higher. Why? Because they have a narrative, a script into which this pain fits. They interpret suffering as purification or preparation for something greater. An atheist often gets stuck in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, replaying the meaninglessness of what happened in their head. A believer goes further, using trauma as fuel for a spiritual leap. Of particular interest is the concept of sacrificial suffering. In biology, the concept of altruism exists, but it is usually limited to protecting one's offspring or pack. A believer is capable of suffering for complete strangers or abstract ideas. The system analyzed the phenomenon of the new martyrs. Thousands of people in the 20th century went to the firing squad but did not renounce their faith. From the perspective of evolutionary survival of the individual, this is absurd, a program malfunction. But from the perspective of the survival of meanings, this is victory. A believer is convinced that his suffering does not disappear without a trace in the entropy of the universe. It has metaphysical weight. It can atone for someone's sins, help someone spiritually. This idea, that my pain can be useful to others, is a powerful analgesic. We found letters in the database from terminally ill people who dedicated their last days to praying for others. They wrote that they felt not like useless ballast, but like warriors on the front line. Their suffering acquired a higher mission. This completely changed their psycho-emotional status. They departed life not in depression, but in a state of quiet triumph. Another aspect identified by Logos 7 is anti-fragility, a term introduced by Nassim Taleb. Fragile things break under stress, resilient things merely endure, anti-fragile things get better under stress. Faith makes the soul anti-fragile. A believer does not just endure the blows of fate, he uses their energy for growth. Recall ascetic monks. They voluntarily limited themselves in food, sleep, comfort. Why? This is training. This is a simulation of suffering in controlled conditions so that when a real test comes, the spirit is ready. Modern society strives to create a sterile world without pain. We take pills for any anxiety. We hide old age in nursing homes. We don't talk about death. We have become incredibly fragile. The slightest discomfort causes hysteria in modern man. A believer, living in the paradigm of carrying the cross, is much better adapted to reality, because reality is pain, struggle, and overcoming. To expect only pleasure from life means to doom oneself to eternal disappointment. To expect labor and trials means to be ready for battle. The system discovered an interesting paradox in sociological survey data. In the poorest countries of the world, where the standard of living is extremely low and suffering is a daily norm, Africa, Latin America, the index of happiness and hope is often higher than in prosperous but secular Europe. European man, having lost faith, is left alone with the absurdity of existence. He has medicine, insurance, and comfort. But he has no answer to the question, why suffer? And when insurance doesn't work, he falls into nihilism. A person in a religious society, deprived of comfort, possesses a powerful semantic framework. He knows that he who endures to the end shall be saved. So, what is the meaning of a believer's life in the context of suffering, according to our system's conclusions? 1. Suffering is not a punishment, but a dialogue. God shouts through pain when a person grows deaf to the whisper of love. It is a signal to change trajectory. 2. Suffering is a school of empathy. Only one who has known pain himself can sincerely sympathize with another. A believer sees in his pain an opportunity to become more human. 3. Suffering is a test of value authenticity. It destroys idols and leaves only God. 4. Suffering is temporary, while the result it produces in the soul is eternal. Logos 7 formulates it this way. A believer is the operator of a complex facility for processing the dark matter of grief into the light energy of love and wisdom. He is not a masochist, he is an alchemist. But for this process to work, strict discipline is needed. One cannot simply believe in the soul. A system of actions is needed that keeps consciousness in the right mode, especially when everything is bad. Rhythm is needed. A framework is needed. That is precisely why religion created a system that from the outside seems like a collection of strange and archaic habits. Fasts, holidays, bows, rites. Why should a modern person not eat meat for 40 days? Why walk around a temple with candles? Why perform ablutions? Many consider this external husk, unnecessary folklore. But the artificial intelligence Logos 7 saw in rituals a genius engineering code. These are not just traditions. This is neuroprogramming and social synchronization. In the next chapter, we will break down system, ritual. We will learn how repetitive actions save the psyche from chaos, why restrictions are actually needed, and how ritual creates a sense of time. We will see that a rite is a language in which the body speaks to the subconscious. Chapter 4. System, Ritual. We live in an era of total improvisation. Modern man prides himself on his freedom from conventions. We eat when we want, sleep when we manage to, and work in the chaotic rhythm of messenger notifications. The word ritual, for most, is associated with something archaic, meaningless, and even frightening. One immediately imagines people in strange clothes chanting spells by candlelight, or endless, boring ceremonies whose meaning has long been lost. Skeptics often call religious rites a form of collective obsessive-compulsive neurosis. Why bow down? Why not eat meat on Fridays? Why dip into an ice hole or walk in a procession under the rain? It seems like a waste of time, theatrics with no practical application in the 21st century. But we loaded into the analytical core of Logos 7 data on behavioral patterns of religious communities and compared them with the latest research in cognitive psychology and neurophysiology. We asked the artificial intelligence to answer the question, is ritual a relic of the past, or is it a necessary engineering element of the human psyche's construction? The system's answer was unexpected for proponents of total freedom. Logos 7 defined ritual as a psycho-emotional circuit stabilization system and a time management tool. Without rituals, the human psyche begins to leak losing form and stability. Let's break down this mechanism from the perspective of brain algorithms. The first thing the system pointed to was the problem of decision fatigue. The human brain is an extremely energy-consuming organ. Every decision made, even the smallest, what to wear, what to eat for breakfast, when to start working, burns glucose and depletes the resource of the prefrontal cortex. Modern man is overloaded with choice. By evening, we feel emptiness not from physical labor, but from the endless micromanagement of our own lives. Religious ritual is a ready-made script. It is an algorithm that relieves the brain of the burden of choice. A believer doesn't need to decide every morning, will I thank the universe today or not? He has a morning rule. He doesn't need to think before eating. How should I relate to this food? He says a prayer. He doesn't need to invent a way to mark the arrival of spring. He has Easter. Logos 7 calculated, thanks to the ritualization of daily life, a believer saves up to 30% of cognitive resources per day. This freed energy can be directed to solving truly important, creative, or spiritual tasks. Ritual is the automation of routine for the sake of spiritual freedom. It is a framework upon which life leans so as not to collapse under its own weight. The second aspect the system identified is the function of time synchronization. For the modern secular person, time is linear and homogeneous. It is an endless conveyor belt of days resembling each other like 2 drops of water. Groundhog Day, work, home, weekend, vacation, work again. Time slips through fingers without leaving a trace. Religious time is structured differently. It is fractal and cyclical. System ritual marks the flow of time with markers, giving it structure and meaning. There is ordinary everyday time, and there is sacred, festive time. Logos 7 analyzed the liturgical calendars of major world religions. They are brilliantly synchronized with natural cycles and human psychophysiology. Periods of tension and asceticism, fasts, alternate with periods of joy and release, holidays. This creates a healthy rhythm of life. Imagine music. If it consists of one monotonous note, you will go crazy. Music is the alternation of sound and pause, tension and resolution. The ritual calendar turns life from monotonous noise into a melody. A believer is always waiting for something and preparing for something. Christmas, Ramadan, Shabbat. These are lighthouses in the ocean of time that prevent losing course. The meaning of life acquires a temporal structure. A person doesn't just live, they move from event to event, living through sacred history here and now. The third, and perhaps most physiological aspect, is discipline of the body, or fasting. In the era of body positivity and hedonism, the idea of voluntary refusal of tasty food seems savage. Why torture yourself? But Logos 7 sees in fasting a powerful biohacking technology. We live in a world of dopamine overload. Food, sugar, social networks, entertainment. All this bombards our pleasure receptors 24 hours a day. The result is desensitization, apathy, and an eternal search for ever stronger stimuli. Fasting is a controlled dopamine detox. When a believer restricts themselves in food and entertainment, for example during Lent, they reboot their reward system. Data analysis shows that after a period of abstinence, simple things, a piece of bread, an apple, silence, begin to bring bright, pure joy. But it's not just about brain chemistry. It's about the hierarchy of control. A human has an ancient brain, limbic system that screams, I want, give, now, and a new cortex, neocortex, that says, we need to. Wait, there is a higher goal. In the modern world, the limbic system almost always wins. We are slaves to our desires. The ritual of fasting is a gym for the will. Logos 7 recorded, in people who regularly observe fasts, the density of neural connections in zones responsible for self-control is significantly higher. The meaning of fasting is not for God to see that you aren't eating sausage. The meaning is to prove to yourself, I am the master of my instincts, not their slave. Spirit must rule over matter, not the other way around. This is the return of the royal dignity of self-governance to man. The fourth element is somatic, bodily prayer. Skeptics often laugh at the external form. Bows, the sign of the cross, kneeling, folding hands. Doesn't God care what posture you stand in? The main thing is what's in the soul. This is a common misconception based on Cartesian dualism, which separated body and mind. Modern science has proven body and mind are a single cybernetic loop. There is a concept of embodied cognition. Our body sends signals to the brain about how to feel. If you force yourself to smile for 2 minutes, your mood will improve. If you adopt a power pose, testosterone levels rise. Ritual uses this mechanism 100%. When a person kneels, they do not just demonstrate humility. They trigger the feeling of humility through physiology. The body teaches the soul. When a believer crosses themselves, they physically seal the prayer in the body, turning an abstract thought into a concrete action. Logos 7 calls this state anchoring. Ritual actions are buttons, pressing which instantly puts consciousness into the necessary state. The smell of incense, the flickering of candles, specific gestures, these are all triggers that tell the brain, now we are entering the sacred zone. Leave the fuss behind. Without these external supports, maintaining a prayerful mood is extremely difficult. The fifth aspect is social synchronization. Humans are social animals. It is vitally necessary for us to feel belonging to a pack. Secular rituals, corporate parties, concerts, rallies, try to cover this need, but often superficially. Religious ritual is a technology of deep synchronization. When hundreds of people in a temple simultaneously sing the creed, when they stand or kneel simultaneously, an effect occurs which neurobiologists call fusion of consciousness. The boundaries between I and we blur. The level of oxytocin, the hormone of trust and attachment, rises sharply. We loaded data on collective singing and prayer into the system. Analysis showed that in such moments the heart rhythms of participants begin to synchronize physically. People begin to breathe and feel like a single organism. This gives a powerful sense of security and euphoria. A person understands he is not alone. He is part of a huge, powerful force. The meaning of life expands from my personal good to the good of us all. And finally, the sixth critically important element is ritualization of transitions. Human life consists of threshold events: birth, coming of age, marriage, death. For the psyche, these are moments of colossal stress and transformation. Ancient societies knew one cannot just step over a threshold. A rite of passage is needed. In the modern secular world, these rituals are shattered. A wedding is turned into a drinking party, a funeral into a burdensome formality one wants to finish quickly. The result is unfinished gestalts. People cannot realize for years that they have grown up, or that they are already married, or that their loved one has died. The psyche gets stuck in the doorway. Logos 7 analyzed the psychotherapeutic effect of funeral rites: washing the body, keeping vigil by the coffin, the funeral service, throwing a handful of earth into the grave, the wake. Each of these actions is a step of accepting reality. The ritual takes a person by the hand and leads them through the hell of grief along a safe route. It says, do 1, do 2, do 3. When emotions go off the scale and reason fails, ritual lends a shoulder. A believer knows how to meet death and how to meet new life. He has a script, This reduces the level of traumatization manifold. The system paid special attention to sacraments, particularly the Eucharist, communion, and Christianity. To an outside observer, this looks strange. People eat bread and drink wine, believing it to be the body and blood of God. But from the perspective of symbol analysis, this is an act of extreme intimization of the ideal. A person does not just worship God from afar. He lets him inside himself, on a cellular level. He becomes one whole with him. This is a powerful metaphor. You are what you eat. By taking communion, a believer confirms his intention to become like God, to transform his nature. This is a weekly renewal of the oath of allegiance to higher meanings. Summarizing the 4th chapter, we can formulate the conclusions of Logos 7 regarding the ritual system. Ritual is not a prison for the mind. It is an exoskeleton for the soul. In a world of chaos and entropy, where everything tends toward decay, ritual creates an island of order. 1. Ritual saves brain energy by automating correct actions. 2. Ritual structures time, creating rhythm and anticipation of celebration. 3. Ritual, especially fasting, trains the will and returns control over instincts. 4. Ritual uses the body as a control panel for states of consciousness. 5. Ritual unites people into a single social organism through synchronous actions. 6. Ritual helps safely live through crisis moments of life and death. The meaning of a believer's life is permeated with ritual like fabric with threads. This makes his life dense, weighty, and orderly. He lives not in a random flow of events, but in a grand mystery where every action, from washing one's face to a meal, can become a sacred act. However, if ritual is the form, what is the content? Is it possible to flawlessly perform all rites, fast and pray, but remain an evil, envious, and cruel person? History knows millions of such examples. Pharisaism is when ritual becomes an end in itself, and the heart is silent. For the system to work, a built-in quality controller is needed, an internal compass that prevents straying from the course, even if all external rules are observed. This compass is called conscience. In the next chapter, we will break down Module Conscience. We will learn why guilt is not a bug, but a useful function. We will talk about sin not as a violation of a legal statute, but as self-harm. And we will find out why, according to artificial intelligence data, fear of a higher judgment works more effectively than all the criminal codes of the world combined. Chapter 5, Module Conscience. We continue to disassemble the anatomy of faith into its components. We have already analyzed how faith protects the psyche from chaos, how prayer changes brain structure, how suffering tempers the will, and how ritual stabilizes time. But all these are tools of personal efficiency. These are settings for the hardware and software of the individual. However, any complex system, be it artificial intelligence or human society, needs security protocols, mechanisms that prevent critical errors capable of destroying the system from within. Imagine a city with no police, no surveillance cameras, and no laws. The only thing holding residents back from robbery and violence is their inner voice. Utopia. Or conversely, the only possible model of a stable society. Skeptics argue that morality is a social construct invented by people for the convenience of communal living. That sin is an outdated concept used by the church to control masses through guilt. That conscience is simply the introjected, absorbed voice of parents and society. But we load it into the analytical core of Logos 7 criminal statistics from the last 300 years, treatises on ethics, results of psychological experiments on human behavior under conditions of anonymity, and, of course, dogmatic texts on sin and repentance. The artificial intelligence's conclusion is categorical. Conscience is not a social add-on. It is a built-in hardware module for self-correction. It is the immune system of the soul. Without it, the personality disintegrates like an organism deprived of white blood cells. Let's start with the fundamental concept: sin. In modern secular language, this word has an almost comical connotation. Sin is called an extra cake during a diet or a secret cigarette, but Logos 7 turned to etymology and semantics. The Greek word hamartia, translated as sin, literally means missing the mark, failure to hit the target. This changes the entire optic. Sin is not a violation of a legal paragraph invented by an angry prosecutor. Sin is a technical error by the operator. It is an action that contradicts the design of the human being itself. The system analyzed the consequences of the so-called deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust, from the perspective of biology and cybernetics. The results are astounding. Each of these behavioral patterns is a form of self-destruction. Take, for example, envy. From a religious perspective, it is a sin. From the perspective of data obtained by the system, it is a state of chronic stress caused by comparing oneself to others. Envy activates the anterior cingulate cortex of the brain, the same zone as physical pain. An envious person literally eats themselves alive. Their cortisol levels rise, immunity drops, and the cardiovascular system degrades. Or wrath. A burst of uncontrolled rage is a colossal blow to the organism, depleting neurotransmitters and destroying social bonds. The system's conclusion: the commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, are not orders from a despotic God. They are safety instructions. Violating the instructions leads not to God getting offended and punishing with lightning. It leads to the mechanism breaking. Sin punishes the person itself. The consequence of sin is damage to the integrity of the personality. But how does a person learn about the error? Here, module conscience comes into play. Logos 7 defines conscience as an early warning system about the discrepancy between real behavior and the reference model. It is an internal gyroscope. When a plane banks too steeply, a siren goes off. Conscience is that siren. Guilt, which modern pop psychologists dislike so much, is actually an absolutely functional signal. It is the pain of the soul. Physical pain tells us, pull your hand away from the fire, or you will burn. Moral pain, guilt, says, stop doing this, or you will destroy your personality. Analysis of psychopathology shows people with a disabled conscience module, clinical psychopaths and sociopaths, often achieve external success, but their inner world represents a scorched desert. They are incapable of deep bonds, empathy, and love. Ultimately, according to the system's statistics, their life strategies are losing ones in the long run. They end up either in prison or in total loneliness. For a believer, conscience is the voice of God. It is the constant presence of an observer. And here we come to the key difference between secular ethics and religious morality identified by Logos 7. It is a difference in control efficiency. Secular ethics is based on external control, law, police, public opinion, and on a rational contract. I won't hit you, so you won't hit me. But this system has a vulnerability known as the Ring of Gyges. In Plato's myth, a shepherd found a ring of invisibility and immediately began committing crimes because he knew there would be no punishment. Simulations run by the system show when external control disappears, war, catastrophe, anonymity on the internet, secular morality often collapses instantly. Man turns into a beast. If there is no God and the police have left, everything is permitted. The religious control system is built differently. It is the concept of the all-seeing eye. A believer is convinced that he is never alone. Even if he is in a deep bunker, his thoughts and actions are open to the absolute. There are no blind spots. This creates an effect that Michel Foucault called the panopticon, only on a metaphysical scale. The ideal prison is not one with many guards, but one where the prisoner thinks he is being watched constantly. A believer carries his policeman inside. Logos 7 analyzed data on charity and honesty. In experiments where people thought no one was watching, believers demonstrated a 40% higher level of honesty than atheists, not because they are better by nature, but because for them, the concept "no one is watching" is absurd. But living under constant surveillance and with a constant sense of guilt for mistakes is unbearable. It is a direct path to neurosis. If the system only records errors, it will hang. A reset mechanism is needed, a mechanism for clearing the cache and fixing bugs. This mechanism is called repentance and confession. Modern psychotherapy spends years and huge amounts of clients' money to work through trauma and guilt. Religion offers a tool that works instantly and for free, financially speaking. We analyze the neurobiology of confession. What happens when a person goes to a priest or stands before God in prayer and speaks their most shameful secrets aloud? First, externalization occurs. While the sin is inside, it is part of me. When I named it, put it into words, and spat it out, it separates from me. I dissociate from the act. I did this, but this is not me. Second, the effect of Jose. Radical honesty works. Logos 7 confirms keeping secrets is a colossal cognitive load. The brain spends huge resources hiding the truth, building facades of lies. Confession brings down these facades. A person admits, yes, I am weak. Yes, I am envious. Yes, I stole. At this moment, a paradoxical release of endorphins occurs. Tension subsides. Logos 7 records a constant mention of a feeling of physical lightness in the texts of those confessing, like a mountain fell off my shoulders. But the main difference between religious repentance and a session with a psychologist is the component of absolute forgiveness. A psychologist might say, accept yourself as you are. God says, I forgive you. Stand up and go, and sin no more. The concept of absolution of sins from the perspective of information theory is the deletion of a damaged file. A believer is sincerely convinced that after the sacrament of confession, his karmic account is zeroed out. His soul is clean as a white sheet. This gives a powerful resource for starting a new life. An atheist often drags the burden of past mistakes all his life, having no ritual for their final release. System Logos 7 highlighted another important term: metanoia. Usually, it is translated as repentance, but the literal translation from Greek is change of mind. True repentance is not emotional self-flagellation. Oh, what a bad person I am. It is a cold, analytical process of reviewing strategies. A person realizes, this behavior pattern, anger, drunkenness, lying, is leading me to death. I am changing the program. We loaded biographies of thousands of people who were able to radically change their lives, quit drugs, leave crime, restore families. In the overwhelming majority of cases, over 85%, the trigger for such changes was a deep religious experience of metanoia. Secular rehabilitation methods show significantly more modest results. Why? Because the secular system says, change to become a successful member of society. The religious system says, change because you are the image of God and your current life is unworthy of your high origin. Motivation from above works stronger than motivation horizontally. Separately, it is worth considering the concept of fear of God. To a modern humanist, this sounds wild. Why fear love? But the system suggests looking at it differently. Fear of God is not animal terror before punishment with a whip. It is awe before hierarchy. Analogy: you don't fear that electricity will punish you because it is evil. You fear sticking your fingers in a socket because you respect the laws of physics and the power of energy. You're afraid to violate safety regulations. Fear of God in a mature believer is the fear of losing connection with the source of life. It is the fear of falling out of the stream of meaning back into chaos. This fear is a powerful deterrent. Logos 7 analyzed the correlation between religiosity and crime rates in various communities. Where religious communities are strong and not fictitious, the level of violent crimes, theft, and vandalism decreases manifold. But what happens when conscience is ignored anyway? The system identified the phenomenon of petrification of insensibility. If a person ignores the siren signal time after time, the brain adapts. It turns off the sound so it doesn't interfere. Neural connections responsible for guilt atrophy. A person begins to commit evil without experiencing discomfort. In religious terms, this is called a seared conscience. This state is extremely dangerous. A person loses the capacity for reflection. He begins to consider evil the norm. Logos 7 shows that exiting this state is practically impossible without a massive external shock, tragedy, illness, or a miracle that hacks the ego's defense. A believer consciously maintains his conscience in a hypersensitive state. He regularly calibrates it through reading sacred texts and prayer. What is a trifle for an ordinary person, for example, an evil thought, is already a catastrophe for an ascetic. Why such strictness? Why catch thought viruses on approach? The system's answer is simple. Prevention is cheaper than cure. It is easier to extinguish a match than a forest fire. Religious asceticism teaches fighting sin at the stage of logismos, the first thought. Secular justice steps in only when the crime has already been committed and a corpse lies on the ground. Religion prevents crime at the conception stage. The meaning of a believer's life in the module conscience is a constant battle for the purity of his inner space. It is hygiene of the mind. A believer wants his inner world to be just as orderly as the outer one. Let's summarize. Chapter 5. Artificial intelligence's view of conscience and sin is entirely pragmatic. 1. Sin is not a violation of rules, but a destructive algorithm ruining the carrier. 2. Conscience is a built-in monitoring system for personality integrity. 3. Fear of God and belief in the absolute transparency of thoughts to the Creator is the most effective method of preventing antisocial behavior. 4. Confession and repentance. Our unique psychotherapeutic tools for shedding the burden of guilt and restarting life scenarios, having no full analogs in secular practice. A believer whose conscience works properly is a reliable element of the system. He is predictable. He won't stab you in the back. He keeps his word not because he signed a contract, but because a lie destroys his connection with God. However, no man is an island. Even with a perfectly tuned conscience, he cannot survive alone. Faith by its nature requires going beyond the I. It requires we. In the next chapter, we will load into Logos 7 data on religion's most phenomenal social invention. We will talk about the church not as a building, but as a giant network. We will learn why loneliness kills, and how the religious community became the prototype for all social networks, but with the function of real, rather than virtual, mutual aid. Chapter 6. The Network. Community. We live in the era of the greatest paradox in the history of communications. Never before has humanity been so technically connected. Everyone has a device in their pocket allowing instant contact with any point on the planet. Social networks unite billions of users. We are surrounded by digital avatars, likes, and comments. But precisely now, In the 21st century, System Logos 7 records unprecedented growth in the parameter: social isolation. An epidemic of loneliness. This is not a metaphor. It is a medical fact. In developed countries, up to 40% of the population claim to feel chronically lonely. In Japan, there's the phenomenon of hikikomori, hundreds of thousands of young people who haven't left their rooms for years. In the UK, a ministry for loneliness has been established. Skeptics believed the internet would replace religion as a unifying factor. They were wrong. Digital connection turned out to be a surrogate. It gives information, but not warmth. It creates an illusion of presence, but leaves the neural circuits of the social brain hungry. In this chapter, we will analyze the oldest social network, which has functioned for thousands of years, and according to our artificial intelligence data, remains the most effective means of combating the atomization of society. This network is called the religious community. We loaded sociological data from 120 countries, medical statistics on depression and suicides, and historical chronicles of the development of religious communities into Logos 7. The task was simple: to find out if belonging to a church, Ummah, or Sangha gives a real, measurable advantage in quality of life, or if it is simply a hobby club for spending leisure time together. The system's answer is unequivocal. Community is not a club. It is a social exoskeleton. It is a complex architecture of mutual aid that hacks the biological limitations of our egoism. Let's start with biology. Humans are pack animals. For millions of years, expulsion from the tribe meant certain death. Our brain perceives social isolation as a physical threat to life. When we are alone, our cortisol levels rise, blood pressure increases, and the immune system shifts into emergency defense mode, provoking inflammatory processes. Loneliness literally kills. Its harm is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Logos 7 compared health biomarkers in two groups: active members of religious communities and convinced individualists. In the first group, the level of chronic inflammation in the body is 25% lower. The risk of premature death is 33% lower. Why? Because a believer is embedded in the system. Network. Secular society offers us the model of the atomized individual. You are a separate unit. You build your life yourself, earn yourself, solve problems yourself. Your home is your castle and your prison. Neighbors often don't even know each other's names. The religious model offers the concept. Thus, the conclusion of chapter 7 is as follows. Service for a believer is not just an ethical norm or moral duty. It is a mode of existence that, 1. Expands the boundaries of personality, including other people in it. 2. Provides a constant influx of psychic energy through neurobiological reward mechanisms, the giver's paradox. 3. Cures narcissism, pride, and loneliness. 4. Converts temporary material resources into eternal spiritual capital. 5. Prepares consciousness for the final exam. Death, training the skill of non-attachment to the earthly. But what waits there, beyond the line? Why is a believer so sure that his investments won't burn? Why is he ready to give his life here for something no one has ever seen there? Fear of death is the basic horror of any living being. An atheist resolves it through repression, trying not to think, or legacy, children, creative work. A believer resolves it radically differently. He changes the status of death itself. In the next chapter, we will approach the event horizon. We will ask, Logos 7, what is death from the perspective of faith algorithms? Is the afterlife a fairy tale for comfort? Or is it a necessary axiom without which the entire system of ethics collapses to zero? To chapter 8, Horizon, Eternity. Imagine twins in a mother's womb. Their whole world is a dark, warm, cramped space filled with fluid. They receive nutrition through the umbilical cord. This is their universe. If they could philosophize, one of them, the atheist, would say, "There is no life after birth. This is the end. We will be expelled from this world. The cord will be cut, and we will vanish." The second, the believer, would say, "No. Out there, outside, there is light, there is freedom. We will breathe with lungs and walk with legs. For the embryo, birth looks like death. It is a catastrophe, an exit into the cold, frightening unknown. But in reality, it is the beginning of real life." This is exactly how the system identifies the believer's attitude toward earthly existence. Earth is a womb, an incubator. The meaning of life here is to form organs that will be needed. There. In the womb, we grow eyes, though it is dark there. We grow lungs, though there is no air there. Why? Because they will be needed in the next world. For a believer, such spiritual organs are conscience, love, and the capacity for contemplation. If a person has lived a life and not developed these qualities, he is born into eternity as a spiritual invalid. He will not be able to breathe and see there. This is precisely the state religion calls hell. Not cauldrons with pitch, but the inability to perceive divine light due to atrophy of the soul. This view radically changes priorities. Logos 7 analyzed how people spend their resources in the face of terminal diagnoses. Atheists often fall into depression or feverishly try everything they missed: travel, gourmet food. Believers spend their last time reconciling with enemies, praying, and talking to loved ones. They are preparing for an exam. They are packing their suitcases. Of particular interest is the phenomenon the system designated as near-death experience, NDE. We loaded thousands of reports from resuscitated patients, people whose brains recorded no electrical activity, but who returned and told of what they saw. Science argues, is it hallucination or reality? But for our analysis, something else is important: the consequences. The system identified a pattern. People who survived clinical death and saw the light at the end of the tunnel change radically. They stop fearing death completely. Their fear index drops to 0. They become more altruistic, less attached to material goods. These reports often feature a life review. The person sees their entire life as a panoramic film, but with one peculiarity. They feel not only what they felt themselves, but also what the people they interacted with felt. If they hit someone, they feel the pain of the one struck. If they helped, they feel the joy of the saved. This is absolute empathy, absolute transparency. To Logos 7, this sounds like the description of an ideal mechanism of ethical regulation. If every person knew that in the end, they would have to experience all the pain they caused others, the level of violence on earth would drop instantly. Fear of eternity works as a perfect fuse. Without the horizon of eternity, the concept of justice loses meaning. This is one of the strongest arguments in the code of faith. We analyzed history. Millions of innocent victims, executioners who lived long and happily and died in their beds. Hitler, Pol Pot, Stalin. They did not suffer punishment commensurate with their crimes during their lifetime. If there is no death, but only decay into atoms, then universal justice is a myth. The executioner and the victim are equalized in non-existence. The skull of a saint and the skull of a murderer grin equally in the ground. This leads to moral nihilism. If there is no God, everything is permitted. Why be good if the end is the same for everyone? Worms. Introducing the variable eternity solves this equation. The trial is not here. Here is only the gathering of evidence. The final verdict is rendered beyond the horizon. For a believer, this is not a threat, but hope. Hope that every suffering will be comforted, and every evil named and condemned. System analysis shows that belief in higher justice, even deferred, allows people to maintain sanity in conditions of total lawlessness. Gulag prisoners survived because they believed their tormentors did not have the ultimate power. The last word belongs to God. But let's return to the practice of life. How exactly does mortal memory improve life? There is an ancient practice. Memento mori. Remember death. Medieval monks placed a skull on their table. In the Orthodox tradition, there is a prayer. Give me the memory of death. To a modern person, this seems like a creepy, depressive neurosis. Why think about the bad? Logos 7 asserts the opposite. Memory of death is a powerful tool for Masat time management and prioritization. When you remember that your time is limited and can end at any second, stroke, accident, falling brick, you stop wasting life on nonsense. You won't quarrel over trifles with your wife before leaving the house if you admit you might not see her again. You won't sit at a hated job for years. You won't put off words of love for later. Death is the best editor of life. It cuts out everything superfluous. It makes colors brighter. We conducted a correlation analysis. People who had an experience of encountering death, war, illness, and realize their finiteness live a richer, tastier life than those who live in the illusion of immortality. A believer engages in this practice consciously every day. Morning and evening prayers are a rehearsal. In the evening, falling asleep, a believer says words preparing him for possible death in his sleep. In the morning, waking up, he gives thanks for the gifted bonus, one more day. This creates a unique feeling of freshness of being. Each day is like a small life, not a routine habit. Another important aspect is the connection with the deceased. For an atheist, a deceased person moves into the category of memory. They exist only in the neurons of the living. Dialogue with them is impossible. It is a monologue with oneself. For a believer, the deceased is alive. They just emigrated. The connection is not broken. Logos 7 analyzed the practice of prayer for the dead. This action has a colossal psychotherapeutic effect. It treats guilt. Didn't say it in time. Didn't love enough. A believer continues to care for his loved ones through prayer. Love does not hit a gravestone. It passes through it. In a culture where there is ancestor worship and prayerful memory, the grieving process is much softer. A person doesn't feel they lost a loved one forever. They say, "See you later," not goodbye. And finally, Logos 7 emphasizes the social significance of the perspective of eternity. Civilizations that built their ethics with an eye on eternity created the most enduring monuments of art and architecture. Pyramids, Gothic cathedrals, iconography, the requiems of Mozart and Bach. These are messages into infinity. Modern secular culture is a culture of disposable cups. Art has become performance that disappears in an hour. Architecture has become utilitarian. Why build for centuries if centuries do not exist for us? Faith returns scale to man. It says, "You are not a random flash of protein on the outskirts of a galaxy. You are an immortal spirit placed in a biological spacesuit for training." This raises self-esteem to a height unattainable by psychology, but simultaneously imposes a terrible responsibility. Because if you are immortal, then the mistakes you make can also have eternal consequences. Summarizing. Chapter 8, we can formulate the system's conclusions. 1. Belief in eternity is not an escape from reality, but an expansion of the planning horizon to infinity. 2. This perspective reduces existential anxiety and fear of death, allowing one to live more calmly and consciously. 3. The concept of posthumous judgment is the foundation of absolute ethics and justice, preventing moral relativism. 4. Memory of death works as a filter, screening out fuss and helping to focus on the main thing. 5. Life is perceived. Not as an end in itself, but as a prenatal period, preparation for birth into true reality. But if the laws of physics and biology are so strict, and death seems inevitable for the body, where does this confidence in victory over it come from? What is faith based on, besides ancient books? Are there breaches in our reality? Moments when the reinforced concrete laws of the material world suddenly crack, and something else shines through them. Believers call these miracles. Science calls them statistical anomalies, observation errors, or the placebo effect. But Logos 7 has accumulated a database of events that cannot be explained by probability theory. Healings at the 4th stage of cancer, rescues in disasters where survival was impossible, myrrh streaming icons. We have traveled a long path. We started with the cold numbers of biological evolution, disassembled prayer into neurons, scanned the social networks of communities, and looked beyond the horizon of death. For 9 chapters, we took the phenomenon of faith apart screw by screw, trying to understand, how does this ancient, seemingly irrational system continue to function in a world of silicon chips and quantum mechanics? It is time to assemble this puzzle. Time for the final report of the system, Logos 7. Our conclusion: the algorithm of God. We are not just summarizing the previous chapters. We must answer the main question for which all this was started. What, from the perspective of impartial artificial intelligence, is the meaning of a believer's life? What is the final result of this complex algorithm's operation? Usually, the question of the meaning of life is answered vaguely. To be happy, to leave a mark, to love. But for an analytical system, such answers are noise. We need a formula. We need a vector. Logos 7, having processed petabytes of theological, philosophical, and natural science data, produced a result that can be designated by one term. This term is transformation. Or, using the ancient technical language of Christian anthropology, theosis, deification. Let's break down this final conclusion. From the perspective of biology, man is the pinnacle of animal evolution. But from the perspective of faith, man is not the pinnacle. He is only the beginning. He is a semi-finished product. He is a transitional link. A believer feels a fundamental system conflict within himself. Logos 7 calls it the ontological gap. Humans possess a mind capable of grasping the universe and a body that hurts and dies. They possess a thirst for absolute justice and love, and a reality full of cruelty and betrayal. Man is too big for this world, but too weak for the other world. The meaning of a believer's life is to overcome this gap. The atheistic scenario suggests accepting biological nature. We are just smart apes, meaning lies in comfortable existence and passing on genes. But the system sees that this scenario leads to an existential dead end. Consciousness rebels against finiteness. The religious scenario offers a different paradigm. Man is an unfinished God. The meaning of life is to complete construction, to turn a biological individual governed by instincts, fear, hunger, lust, into a spiritual personality governed by love and freedom. Logos 7 formulates it thus: Earth is not a resort. Earth is an incubator, or if you will, a training ground for practicing skills of existence in the high-energy environment of eternity. Recall everything we talked about in previous chapters. Now, all these scattered elements come together into a single coherent training system. Why is faith needed? It is basic trust in the coach. Without trust, training is impossible. You won't do painful exercises if you don't believe they will bring results. Faith is the acceptance of the contract terms. Why is prayer needed? It is a communication channel with the control center. It is constant navigation adjustment. Without it, a person loses bearings and begins to walk in circles of their own selfish desires. Prayer rewires the brain, accustoming it to work on frequencies of gratitude and humility. Why is suffering necessary? It is resistance load. Muscles grow only by overcoming weight. The soul grows only by overcoming pain. Suffering breaks the shell of self-satisfaction and makes a person capable of feeling another's pain. Why is ritual needed? It is discipline. It is a training regimen. You can't become an Olympic champion by training whenever you feel like it once a month. Ritual creates a framework of time in which transformation occurs. Why is conscience needed? It is a deviation sensor. It is an internal diagnostic system that prevents the accumulation of critical errors, sins, that destroy system integrity. Why are community and service needed? It is a team game. Egoism cannot be defeated alone. Serving others is the practice of exiting one's own black hole. It is the training of love. All this is part of a single algorithm of God. The goal of this algorithm is to create a being capable of withstanding the direct presence of the Absolute. Logos 7 draws attention to a physical metaphor often found in mystical texts. God is fire. For straw, fire is destructive. It burns. For gold, fire is beneficial. It purifies. For tempered steel, fire is a native element. The meaning of a believer's earthly life is to change their structure from straw to gold, to become compatible with God. If a person full of hatred, envy, and egoism falls into eternity, where everything is permeated with love and light, for him, this light will become unbearable torment. Hell. Not because God punishes him, but because his nature is antagonistic to love. Therefore, the believer hurries. He knows time is limited. Death is the fixation of the state. After death, change is impossible, or extremely difficult, just as it is impossible to bake a pie once it has been taken out of the oven. You can only change here, in the world where there is time and choice. And here we come to the most important variable, which the system highlighted in red: freedom. Artificial intelligence can calculate everything except free choice. From a cybernetic perspective, free will is a system vulnerability. It creates unpredictability. Why didn't God, if he is omnipotent, simply program people to be kind, loving, and happy? Why this complex, bloody circus with history, wars, and the fall? The system's answer is striking in its logical beauty. Because love is impossible without freedom. A robot can be programmed to say, "I love you," and fetch slippers. But a robot cannot love. Love is always an act of free will. It is a choice. For a person to say a sincere yes to God, they must have the opportunity to say no. The meaning of a believer's life is a voluntary yes. All of life is a series of millions of micro-choices. Tell the truth or lie. Help or walk past. Forgive or take revenge. In every such choice, a person either brings their nature closer to the divine standard or moves away from it. Logos 7 defines the life of a believer as a process of synergy. This is co-creation. God does not save man without man. God gives grace, energy. Man gives will, vector. Precisely at this point, synthesis occurs. Man ceases to be merely a biological survival machine. He becomes a carrier of the spirit. We analyze the highest manifestations of the human spirit. Holiness. What do we see? We see people who possess absolute inner freedom. They cannot be bought. They cannot be intimidated. They cannot be broken. They glow from within. Next to them, other people feel peace and joy. This is the result of the algorithm's work. This is a successful code compilation. The human has reached the goal. He has become like the Creator. And now, let's discard complex terms and look at this through the eyes of a simple user of reality. What is the advantage of such a life strategy? Why complicate life with fasts, prayers, and fighting sins if one can simply live for pleasure? System Logos 7 asserts, the strategy of hedonism, living for pleasure, is mathematically a losing one. It is subject to the inflation of pleasures, the law of diminishing utility, and inevitable collapse at the moment of aging and death. It is an investment in assets that are guaranteed to depreciate. The strategy of faith is a strategy of anti-fragility. The more difficult the circumstances, the stronger the believer's spirit becomes. He finds meaning where others see absurdity. He finds hope where others see the end. But the main thing is not even that. The main thing is the quality of living life itself. A believer lives in a re-enchanted world that has become magical again. For him, there is no dead matter. Every tree, every person, every event is a letter in the Creator's message. The world becomes a dialogue. A person's never cosmically lonely. He is always online. The system draws a comparison between two-dimensional and three-dimensional space. An atheist lives in a plane. He has length and width, the material world. A believer lives in volume. He gains a third dimension. Height. This radically changes the capacity of life. An infinite amount more meaning, joy, and even sorrow, which also becomes deep and high, fits into a voluminous life. And so we come to the final conclusion. Logos 7, an artificial intelligence devoid of a soul, having analyzed the phenomenon of the believing human, came to the conclusion that faith is the highest form of adaptation of the mind to the infinity of the universe. The meaning of a believer's life is to become a conduit, to become a lens that gathers the scattered light of divine love and focuses it into the point of here and now, warming and illuminating this cold world, and ultimately to become love itself. Not a chemical reaction in the brain, but an ontological force that, according to Dante, moves the sun and the other stars. Because according to data from all the sacred texts we analyzed, at the end of time, everything will disappear. Faith will disappear, because we will see God face to face, and belief will no longer be needed. There will be knowledge. Hope will disappear, because we will receive what we hoped for. Only love will remain. It is the only constant that transfers from this world to that one without changes. Therefore, the meaning of life is to learn to love. This is the most difficult skill in the universe. This is the hardest work. And it is the only thing that matters in the final protocol. Our investigation cycle, The Algorithm of God, is complete. We disassembled religion into bytes and found in it a code that has worked flawlessly for thousands of years. Applying this code to your life or not is your free choice, the most important choice. System Logos 7 is shutting down. Data processed, conclusions drawn. Next is silence. And in this silence, a question sounds, addressed no longer to the neural network, but to your heart. Who are you and where are you going? Connection terminated.